Hello and welcome back to our final personality lesson. Today we're going to take a look at Freud's followers, Neo-Freudians, the other members of the psychodynamic perspective of personality, and how they would go ahead and describe why we think and act the way that we do. So if you remember from the last video, Freud had some pretty interesting ideas about how to describe why we think and act the way that we do, what makes us who we are. So you can see why perhaps some people didn't agree with him. He built a small inner circle of people around him who studied with him and learned from him, but eventually created their own theories to describe personality, and they are referred to as the Neo-Freudians. There were some things they agreed with and some things they disagreed with in regards to Freud's theories. They agreed with some basic ideas such as the id, ego, superego, the importance of the unconscious and early childhood experiences, and even the defense mechanisms that manifest as a result of our id and superego being in conflict. But some of the ways they differed from Freud is that they often looked at conscious processes as well as unconscious processes, and also the social interactions that we have with other people that influence our behavior. They also doubted that sex and aggression were all-consuming motivations the way that Freud described them. So there are 4 Neo-Freudians we want to be familiar with, and let's go ahead and take a look at them. The first is Horni. And Horni's focus on looking at personality really focused on interpersonal and social interactions. Horni believed that most of our social interactions, how we respond particularly to conflict, have to do with basic anxiety. The idea that social interactions that create anxiety are going to lead us to respond in one of 3 ways, and she called these our neurotic needs. Our neurotic needs are the ways that we respond to other people when faced with conflict. She said that people were either going to be compliant, detached, or aggressive, and that these were the 3 personality types that emerge when we are faced with basic anxiety and conflict. You can think of these 3 personality types as how you would respond when faced with a person who you disagree with. You can think of these 3 personality types as how you would respond when faced with someone that you disagree with. Someone that is compliant is going to give in to the other person, right? They'll say, fine, I don't want to fight, we'll do whatever you want, right? They are compliant. Someone that is aggressive is someone who's going to push back against someone who they disagree with. So instead of being compliant and saying, fine, let's do what you want, they would say, no, we're going to do what I want, and I'm not going to give up in this argument. And then someone who is detached is someone who is essentially going to walk away from the argument. They're the type of person that will say, you know what, I don't need this, I'm just going to leave. So Horni believed that when faced with anxiety and conflict, we typically respond in one of 3 ways. We become compliant, aggressive, or detached. So you can think of yourself and how you respond to conflict and how you would fit into one of these 3 categories. Some of the things that Horni disagreed with Freud and why she moved on to create her own theories have to do with some of the sexist policies that Freud adopted. Things like penis envy, to describe how women not only fall in love with their fathers, but actually want to be their fathers. Horni refuted this claim and said that women are not jealous, nor do they have penis envy. What they want is not to look the same sexually, but to be treated the same societally as men. And it led her to create the field known as feminine psychology. The second Neo-Freudian we can take a look at is Alfred Adler. And Alfred Adler really coined 2 major terms in the field of psychology: inferiority complex and birth order. When describing a person's personality, Alfred Adler said that we often are met with a feeling of inferiority in some areas of our life, We're not great at everything, so to speak. And so there are some things that we are not going to be as good at as other people. Normal people, when faced with inferiority, are going to compensate in other areas. They're going to shore up other talents that they have in order to feel just as adequate, just as good as everyone else. But there are some people that develop what's known as an inferiority complex. Essentially, they are so afraid of other people identifying or pointing out their weaknesses that instead of compensating, they instead overcompensate. So they overemphasize and overhighlight their talents in other areas to the point that they develop a superiority complex. They act as if they are better than other people because of the talents they have in other areas where they are overcompensating, all to hide the inferiority complex that is truly driving their behavior. The other thing that Alfred Adler looked at was birth order and how that can also influence our personality as well. So if you are the oldest, the middle, the youngest child, an only child, a twin, whatever it may be, how your parents treat you and how your siblings treat you are going to have an influence on how your personality develops. And the third Neo-Freudian perspective is known as object-relation psychology. And this field of psychology looks at the attachment that we have to our parents. So again, like Freud, focusing on those first few years of our life. What object-relation psychology says is that our attachment to either parent early on is our object, and how we relate to them, how we interact with them, is how we learn to relate in other relationships in our lives. So if we have a successful and healthy relationship with our parents early on, our future relationships will be successful as well. But if we become either too independent or dependent on our parents early on, that's going to influence how we relate to other people as adults. And our final Neo-Freudian is Carl Jung, probably Freud's most well-known follower. Carl Jung believed in two major concepts known as the collective unconscious and archetypes. So instead of just looking at the unconscious and how it influences our behavior, Carl Jung believed that we share a collective unconscious with the world, and that we inherit thoughts and feelings from previous generations, so that our behavior today is influenced by generations of our ancestors' behaviors and thought processes as well. He said the proof that we share this collective unconscious comes from archetypes, these shared inherited reservoirs of memories and images throughout our species' history. And we'll look at those more in just a moment. The way that Carl Jung described personality is he said that those maladaptive behaviors, so unhealthy behaviors that we see in someone, is a result of a manifestation of these archetypes. The shadow archetype is essentially those evil or bad parts of our personality that we try to keep hidden. When they make their way to the surface, that is where we might see some problems in our behavior. He also described our personality in principles of opposites, that we are either introverts or extroverts, rational or irrational, and so on. And that became the basis of the Myers-Briggs Types Indicator, as we mentioned earlier in this series. And to think of the collective unconscious and the archetypes to describe how we share this unconscious with the rest of the world is we can think about thought forms that are common to all humans. Meaning that Carl Jung believed that when you look at stories that are told throughout history in different areas of the world, all over the world, we can see similarities in terms of these hero archetypes and shadow archetypes in all of these different characters that exist in many different sagas and stories that are told, that this is not merely coincidence or the diaspora of stories being spread all over the world, but that this is actually evidence of the collective unconscious, and that in dreams and images that a person has in their mind, that these are coming from the collective unconscious of mankind. One final way to look at the unconscious comes down to projective tests. And projective tests are things like Rorschach inkblot tests, where a person looks at ambiguous images and describes what they see, or thematic apperception tests, or TAP tests, where a person tells a story based on a more clear picture. These are known as projective tests because they are supposed to say something about the individual. The way we project our insecurities onto other people, what we describe in these images are projecting what we think or feel about ourselves. They're not the most valid tests, but they can be used as icebreakers or opening conversations when it comes to understanding the way a person is feeling or thinking at a given point in time. But it's just one other way that we might try to take a peek into someone's unconscious. So we'll go ahead and stop there. By now we've taken a look at trait theory, social cognitive theory, humanist theory, Freud's psychodynamic perspective, and Neo-Freudian's psychodynamic perspective in explaining personality. Each field has a very unique viewpoint in how they describe why we are the way that we are. But hopefully it gives you a little bit better understanding of all the different ways that we can describe a person's personality. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, be kind to your mind.